Your translator is lying. The words left Naomi Carter's lips so quietly that they should have disappeared beneath the soft music drifting through the private dining room, yet somehow they cut through the silence more sharply than any raised voice ever could. Dominic Castellano stopped with his pen only an inch above the contract. Every executive around the polished walnut table turned toward the young black waitress, standing beside him, with a crystal water pitcher still balanced carefully in her hands. She had no business speaking. She had no invitation to interrupt. She was supposed to be invisible. The luxurious restaurant overlooking Manhattan glittered beneath warm chandeliers, every window reflecting the skyline like polished glass, while servers in tailored uniforms moved with rehearsed precision between tables reserved for billion-dollar conversations. Naomi had worked there for 11 months, long enough to memorize every protocol.
Smile.
Refill glasses before they were empty. Never interrupt negotiations. Never make eye contact longer than necessary. Above all else, never involve yourself in the affairs of powerful people. She had followed every rule until this moment. Across from Dominic sat Chairman Kong Min-jae, the distinguished Korean businessman whose calm smile never quite reached his eyes. Between the two men stood Ethan Brooks, the interpreter hired specifically for tonight's international agreement. His voice flowed confidently between English and Korean, smooth enough that nobody questioned a single sentence. Nobody except Naomi. She had recognized the first mistake nearly 5 minutes earlier. At first she assumed it was harmless. Then came another. And another. They were not simple translation errors. Ethan wasn't stumbling over vocabulary. He was changing intentions, softening warnings, replacing careful conditions with promises that had never been spoken. Naomi's pulse pounded harder with every sentence she carried to the table along with fresh coffee and sparkling water. She wanted to believe she had misunderstood, but Korean had become part of her life long before anyone handed her a serving tray. As a little girl growing up in Queens, she had spent nearly every afternoon in the apartment next door with Mrs. Han, an elderly immigrant who had cared for Naomi while her exhausted mother worked double shifts. Mrs. Han had spoken almost no English, so Naomi learned Korean the same way children learn laughter, naturally, one conversation at a time. Years later, after Mrs. Han passed away, the language remained tucked quietly inside her, invisible just like the woman who spoke it. No employer had ever asked. No customer had ever cared. Tonight it became impossible to ignore. Dominic slowly lifted his eyes from the unsigned contract and studied Naomi for the first time since entering the restaurant. His expression carried neither anger nor surprise. It carried calculation. The room seemed to stop breathing. Even the soft clink of silverware from neighboring tables faded into an uneasy stillness. Ethan let out a short, nervous laugh. "I'm sorry about that," he said, smiling politely toward Dominic. She must have misunderstood something she overheard. Naomi felt every eye measuring her uniform before measuring her words. A waitress. A young black woman balancing a water pitcher. Someone whose opinion had never been requested. She could still apologize. She could pretend she had spoken too quickly. She could return to the kitchen and let the meeting continue exactly as planned. Instead, she met Dominic's steady gaze and spoke with quiet certainty. "Sir," she said, "I didn't misunderstand a single word. He isn't translating what Chairman Kong is actually saying." Dominic Castellano did not speak immediately. Years of negotiating with powerful people had taught him that silence often revealed more than questions ever could. His fingers remained resting lightly on the expensive fountain pen while his sharp gray eyes shifted from Naomi to Ethan and finally toward Chairman Kong. The Korean businessman maintained his calm expression, unaware that the conversation unfolding in English was no longer matching the one he believed was taking place. Ethan adjusted his tie and released another polite laugh that sounded noticeably tighter than before. "Mr. Castellano, I assure you everything has been translated accurately. She is simply confused." Naomi felt every instinct urging her to lower her eyes and step away, but another memory surfaced instead. She was 8 years old again, sitting beside Mrs. Han at a tiny kitchen table in Queens while the older woman carefully corrected her pronunciation one gentle word at a time. Mrs. Han always smiled before repeating the same lesson. Language carries trust. When someone changes the words, they also change the heart. Naomi had never forgotten that sentence. She looked directly at Dominic. Chairman Kong never agreed to exclusive distribution rights, she said carefully. He said he wanted both sides to continue building trust before making that commitment. Mr. Brooks translated it as if the agreement was already final. Dominic slowly turned toward Ethan. Is that true? Ethan answered without hesitation. It is a common business interpretation. Korean executives often speak indirectly. I simplified his meaning to avoid unnecessary confusion. Naomi shook her head.
No, sir.
He was not speaking indirectly. He was being very precise. Ethan's smile disappeared for only a fraction of a second before returning. With respect, I have worked as an interpreter for 12 years. Naomi answered just as calmly. I am not questioning your resume. I am questioning the sentence you chose to say. Around the table, expensive watches rested on folded hands while attorneys exchanged uncertain glances. Nobody interrupted. Dominic noticed something that had escaped everyone else. Chairman Kong had been watching Ethan with growing curiosity, almost as though he expected a response that never came. Instead of continuing the discussion in Korean, the chairman quietly reached for his teacup and waited. Dominic leaned back in his chair. Interesting. He folded the unsigned contract and placed it neatly beside his plate. If there is even a small chance that my understanding of this agreement is incomplete, then I would rather lose 10 minutes tonight than regret 10 years tomorrow. Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sir, delaying the signing could damage the relationship. Dominic never looked away from him. If the relationship depends on avoiding questions, then perhaps it deserves questions. The room fell silent once again. Naomi could hear the faint hum of the city far below the restaurant's floor-to-ceiling windows and the distant clink of glasses from another private room. Every second felt heavier than the last. Dominic finally shifted his attention back to Naomi. You made a very serious accusation in front of people whose time is extremely valuable. His voice remained calm, almost gentle, which somehow made the moment even more intimidating. If you are correct, you may have protected everyone sitting at this table. If you are wrong, you interrupted an international negotiation without cause. Naomi tightened her grip around the crystal pitcher until her hands stopped trembling. Then she took one slow breath and answered with complete confidence. Give me 60 seconds alone with Chairman Kong, and I will prove exactly what he has been trying to say all evening. Dominic studied Naomi for another long moment before giving a single quiet nod. You have 60 seconds. Ethan immediately stepped forward. Sir, that would violate every professional protocol. The chairman requested an official interpreter. Dominic raised one finger, and the room became silent again. I requested honesty. That comes before protocol. Naomi carefully placed the crystal pitcher onto the sideboard and walked toward Chairman Kong with measured confidence. Every eye followed her. She stopped several feet away, bowed respectfully, exactly as Mrs. Han had taught her years ago, and greeted him in fluent Korean. Chairman Kang's expression changed instantly. His polite business smile softened into genuine surprise. He answered naturally, without hesitation, as though speaking to someone he had known for years. Around the table, nobody understood a single word except Ethan, whose shoulders grew noticeably tense with every sentence exchanged. Naomi listened carefully, never interrupting, occasionally nodding with quiet respect. Chairman Kong spoke calmly, choosing his words with deliberate precision. When he finished, Naomi thanked him with another respectful bow before turning back toward Dominic. The entire exchange had lasted less than 1 minute, yet the atmosphere inside the private dining room felt completely transformed. Dominic leaned forward. Tell me exactly what he said. Naomi met his eyes without the slightest trace of fear. Chairman Kong said he admired your reputation for keeping your word. He came tonight hoping to build a long-term partnership based on mutual trust, but he specifically said he was not prepared to grant exclusive distribution rights until both companies completed a successful 1-year cooperation period. He also said there was one additional condition that had never been mentioned in English. Dominic's expression hardened slightly. What condition? Naomi answered carefully. He wants both sides to conduct independent financial audits before signing the final agreement because transparency matters more to him than speed. A heavy silence settled over the room. Dominic slowly turned toward Ethan. Was any of that included in your translation? Ethan forced a smile that appeared more strained by the second. The chairman was speaking in cultural nuances. I summarized the practical meaning for efficiency. Before Dominic could answer, Chairman Kong spoke in Korean once more, this time with noticeably greater emphasis. Naomi listened, then translated immediately. He says that efficiency without accuracy destroys trust. Those were his exact words. Chairman Kong looked directly at Dominic while waiting for Naomi to finish. Then, to everyone's surprise, he gave a slow approving nod, confirming every sentence she had translated. Several attorneys around the table quietly exchanged glances before opening the bilingual draft agreement that had been prepared earlier. One lawyer carefully compared the Korean text against the English version while another reviewed the handwritten notes Ethan had been using throughout the meeting. The pages turned faster and faster. Within moments, subtle differences began appearing everywhere. Small phrases had been omitted. Conditions had been softened. Careful limitations had become confident promises. None of the individual changes seemed dramatic by themselves, yet together they completely altered the balance of the agreement. Dominic remained perfectly still, but his attention sharpened with every discovery. He was no longer looking at the contract. He was looking at the people around it. Across the polished walnut table, Ethan quietly reached for his leather briefcase as though preparing to organize his documents. Naomi noticed the movement immediately. It was small enough that almost nobody else would have recognized it. Almost nobody except someone who had spent years observing people from the background. She calmly looked toward Dominic and spoke in an even voice. Sir, before anyone leaves this room, I believe there is one more truth that deserves to be translated. Dominic did not take his eyes off Ethan. The interpreter's hand rested on the leather briefcase for only a second before slowly pulling away, but that single movement was enough to change the rhythm of the room. Dominic noticed everything. Chairman Kong noticed it as well. Even the attorneys stopped turning pages. The quiet confidence that had filled the meeting only minutes earlier had disappeared, replaced by a silence so complete that the gentle hum of the climate control system seemed unusually loud. Ethan straightened his jacket and forced another courteous smile. I believe this meeting has become unnecessarily emotional, he said. Translation is rarely perfect. Small differences happen in every international negotiation. Naomi remained standing beside the table, her posture calm despite every pair of eyes fixed upon her. She knew exactly how unbelievable this situation looked. A waitress was questioning a professional interpreter in front of executives who managed companies worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She could almost hear the voice of her late neighbor, Mrs. Han, reminding her that truth did not become weaker simply because it came from an unexpected person. Dominic finally spoke. Naomi, you said there was one more truth. She nodded slowly. Yes, sir. There was one sentence that bothered me more than all the others. Ethan answered immediately. There were dozens of technical expressions. She probably misunderstood a business idiom. Naomi looked directly at him for the first time that evening. It was not an idiom. She then turned back toward Dominic. Chairman Kong thanked you for protecting your employees because he believes a leader's character is revealed by how ordinary people are treated. Mr. Brooks translated that sentence as a compliment about your financial success. Chairman Kong quietly listened before speaking another short sentence in Korean. Naomi translated without hesitation. He says that respect cannot be purchased. It must be demonstrated. The chairman gave another approving nod. One of Dominic's attorneys quickly compared the original Korean draft with the certified translation prepared earlier that afternoon. His expression changed almost immediately. Mr. Castellano, he said carefully, she is correct again. That paragraph is completely different. Another attorney adjusted his glasses and began reviewing the remaining documents line by line. More discrepancies appeared with every page. None of them completely reversed the agreement, yet every change favored one interpretation over another. Dominic folded his hands together. His face revealed almost nothing, but everyone around the table understood he was no longer evaluating words. He was evaluating trust. Ethan cleared his throat. Perhaps another certified translator should review everything tomorrow. Dominic replied calmly. That would have been excellent advice before tonight began. Ethan hesitated before offering another explanation. I was attempting to make both parties feel more comfortable. Naomi quietly answered before anyone else could speak. Real understanding creates comfort. Altered words create uncertainty. No one interrupted her. The statement settled over the room with surprising weight. Chairman Kong slowly rose from his chair. Instead of addressing Dominic, he walked around the polished table until he stood in front of Naomi. For a brief moment, everyone wondered what he intended to do. Then, the distinguished businessman offered a respectful bow, thanking her in Korean for protecting the integrity of the conversation. Naomi returned the gesture with equal respect. When Dominic witnessed Chairman Kong honoring the waitress that every person in the room had overlooked only minutes earlier, he understood that the most valuable person at the negotiation had never been seated at the table. She had been quietly serving it. Dominic remained seated for several quiet seconds after Chairman Kong returned to his chair. No one reached for the contract anymore. No one touched a glass or adjusted a chair. The negotiation had transformed into something far more important than a business agreement. It had become a question of integrity. Dominic slowly closed the folder containing the draft contract and looked toward the attorneys. I want every translated document reviewed from the beginning. Every sentence. Every note. Every attachment. The legal team immediately spread the paperwork across the polished walnut table, comparing the English and Korean versions line by line. The only sounds filling the private dining room were the turning of pages and the scratching of expensive fountain pens against yellow legal pads. Naomi quietly stepped back toward the service station, believing her role in the evening had finally ended. She had never expected praise. Knowing that Chairman Kong had been understood correctly was enough for her. She reached for the water pitcher again, intending to disappear into the background where everyone expected her to belong. Naomi. Dominic's calm voice stopped her before she could take another step. She turned respectfully. Please stay. It was the first time anyone had ever asked her to remain in a meeting instead of quietly leaving one. Across the table, one attorney suddenly paused, carefully rereading a paragraph before sliding both documents toward Dominic. There is another discrepancy, he said. This one is significant. Dominic studied both versions in silence, while Naomi watched from a respectful distance. Chairman Kong observed the exchange without speaking, patiently allowing the truth to unfold on its own. Dominic finally looked up. Explain it. The attorney adjusted his glasses. The Korean version says that either party may suspend negotiations if concerns about transparency arise. The English version completely removes that protection. Without it, Chairman Kong would have far fewer options if future disagreements developed. Dominic slowly nodded. Would I have known that tonight? No, sir. Another attorney spoke before anyone else could. There are at least 7 meaningful alterations throughout these documents. Individually, they appear minor. Together, they reshape the entire negotiation. Ethan lowered his eyes to the table. His confidence, so effortless at the beginning of the evening, had quietly dissolved. Dominic noticed something else. Throughout the review, Chairman Kong had remained remarkably composed. There was no anger in his expression, only disappointment. The Korean executive finally spoke, looking directly at Naomi rather than anyone else. She translated with the same calm precision she had shown all evening. He says that successful partnerships begin when people choose honesty even after honesty becomes uncomfortable. The sentence lingered in the room. Nobody rushed to answer. Dominic slowly stood from his chair, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lights of Manhattan. The city below glittered with endless ambition, yet at that moment his attention rested on something much smaller. A waitress who had chosen truth over comfort. He turned back toward the table. Every person in this room was selected because of experience, education, or reputation, he said quietly. Tonight, the person with none of those titles protected every one of us. Several executives lowered their eyes, reflecting on how easily they had dismissed Naomi only minutes earlier. Dominic looked at Chairman Kong. Naomi translated every word with careful accuracy as the two leaders agreed to postpone the signing until an entirely new translation could be prepared together. For the first time that evening, both men smiled with genuine confidence. The agreement had been delayed, yet trust had finally begun. The meeting officially ended, yet nobody seemed eager to leave the private dining room. The unsigned contracts remained neatly stacked in the center of the walnut table, no longer symbols of delay, but reminders that trust had been preserved before it could quietly disappear. Outside the towering windows, the lights of Manhattan shimmered across the river, while inside the room a different kind of clarity slowly settled over everyone present. Dominic invited Chairman Kong to remain for coffee while the attorneys organized every document for a complete bilingual review. Naomi instinctively reached for the empty cups, returning to the work she had been hired to do. She moved with the same quiet professionalism she had shown every day since joining the restaurant, never expecting the evening to become about her. As she collected the china, she overheard one attorney speaking softly to another. If she had stayed silent, we never would have caught any of this. The other attorney nodded. We would have signed everything without asking a single question. Naomi continued clearing the table as though she had heard nothing. Recognition had never been the reason she spoke. She simply could not watch honest words become dishonest agreements. Dominic watched her for a long moment before addressing Chairman Kong once more. Naomi translated naturally, her voice steady and respectful. Dominic apologized that the evening had unfolded under such unfortunate circumstances and thanked the chairman for his patience. Chairman Kong smiled warmly before answering in Korean. Naomi listened carefully and translated every sentence exactly as it had been spoken. He says that mistakes do not define a partnership. The willingness to correct them does. Dominic gave a quiet nod. Please tell him I agree completely. Chairman Kong responded again, this time looking directly at Naomi. He also says that every successful organization depends on people whose integrity remains unchanged even when nobody is watching. Naomi lowered her eyes with humble appreciation before translating his words. The compliment felt heavier than any applause could have been. One of Dominic's senior attorneys approached carrying a thin folder. Mr. Castellano, we finished comparing Mr. Brooks's handwritten preparation notes with the official translation package. Dominic accepted the folder without opening it immediately. What did you find? The attorney answered carefully. Several revisions were made before tonight's meeting that were never requested by either legal team. We cannot determine the reason yet, but the changes were intentional rather than accidental. Dominic remained calm. Then we will let the facts speak before anyone else does. There was no anger in his voice, only quiet certainty. Chairman Kong listened as Naomi translated every word, then responded with another thoughtful observation. He says that truth has remarkable patience. It always arrives, even when delayed. Dominic smiled slightly. Your chairman has a talent for saying in one sentence what most people cannot explain in an entire speech. The atmosphere inside the room grew noticeably lighter. Coffee was poured. Genuine conversation replaced guarded negotiation. Business titles slowly faded behind simple human respect. As Naomi carried another tray toward the kitchen entrance, Dominic called her name once again. She stopped and turned. Tonight you reminded everyone at this table that expertise is valuable, but character is priceless. Naomi smiled gently before answering with complete sincerity. Sir, Mrs. Han used to tell me that every language has different words, but honesty always sounds the same. For several quiet seconds, nobody spoke. The city continued glowing beyond the glass. The contracts remained unsigned, and yet everyone understood that the most important agreement of the evening had already been reached without a single signature. It was the silent agreement that truth would never again be ignored simply because it came from someone wearing a server's uniform. The following morning, the same private dining room looked completely different. The polished table remained, The skyline still stretched beyond the towering windows, and the fresh coffee carried the familiar aroma of expensive roasted beans. Yet the atmosphere had changed from cautious negotiation to deliberate transparency. Dominic had invited Chairman Kong back with a newly assembled bilingual legal team, including 2 independent certified translators who had never worked with either organization before. Naomi had reported for her regular breakfast shift, expecting nothing more than another ordinary day. She was surprised when the restaurant manager quietly informed her that Mr. Castellano had specifically requested she remain available throughout the meeting. She nodded politely, still wearing the same simple black server uniform that made her nearly invisible to most guests. As the new translators compared every document sentence by sentence, the discoveries became impossible to dismiss. Every correction Naomi had identified the previous evening proved accurate. More importantly, every disputed phrase now carried the same meaning in both languages. Chairman Kong smiled with visible relief each time another page was verified. Dominic watched the process carefully, saying very little. He had learned that patient observation often revealed more than quick conclusions. Nearly an hour later, one of the independent translators closed the final folder. "Everything now matches perfectly," she said. The original Korean version and the revised English version communicate exactly the same obligations, expectations, and protections for both parties. Dominic thanked her before turning toward Chairman Kong. Naomi translated naturally, no longer thinking about every word because the language flowed as comfortably as her own. Chairman Kong answered with genuine warmth. He says this is the first time since arriving in New York that he feels every person in the room is participating in the same conversation. Dominic smiled. "Please tell him that is exactly how business should begin." Naomi translated, and the chairman nodded with quiet satisfaction. The attorneys exchanged relieved glances before organizing the corrected contracts into neat stacks. The complicated tension that had filled the previous evening seemed to dissolve into something far stronger than confidence. It became mutual respect. During a brief break, one of the younger attorneys approached Naomi near the coffee station. "May I ask you something?" he said politely. Naomi smiled. "Of course. Why did you never mention that you speak Korean?" She paused for a moment before answering. "No one ever asked." The attorney looked genuinely surprised. "You could have pursued international business, law, or diplomacy." Naomi gave a small smile. "Life does not always follow the plans we imagine. Sometimes the opportunity arrives much later than the education." Before he could respond, Dominic walked toward them carrying the revised agreement. "Actually," he said, "sometimes the opportunity arrives exactly when character has finished preparing for it." Naomi lowered her eyes, uncertain how to respond. Dominic continued, speaking calmly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Last night you protected a conversation. Today you helped restore trust. Those are 2 very different accomplishments." Chairman Kong overheard the exchange and added something in Korean that made several members of his delegation smile. Naomi translated with quiet humility. "He says that some people spend years learning foreign languages. Others spend years learning how to listen. The rarest people master both." The room fell comfortably silent. Nobody looked at Naomi as though she were simply the waitress anymore. They looked at her as someone whose knowledge had changed the course of an important partnership, and for the first time since she began working in that elegant restaurant, she no longer felt invisible. The revised contracts were signed just before noon beneath the same crystal chandeliers that had witnessed confusion only hours earlier. This time, every page was read in both languages before a single signature touched the paper. Every question was answered openly. Every sentence carried the same meaning in English and Korean. When Dominic and Chairman Kong finally exchanged the completed agreements, there was no applause, only a quiet sense that something far more valuable than a successful business deal had been accomplished. Trust had been earned instead of assumed. As members of both delegations began gathering their briefcases and organizing documents, Chairman Kong requested one final moment before everyone departed. He stood slowly and spoke in Korean with calm dignity, while every person in the room instinctively turned toward Naomi. She translated carefully, refusing to add or remove even a single word. "Chairman Kong says that in his country there is an old belief that the strongest bridge is built by the person who notices the first crack before anyone else. He believes that person was Naomi. A respectful silence followed. Several executives lowered their heads in quiet reflection. Dominic stepped forward, not toward the chairman, but toward Naomi. For the first time since she had begun working at the restaurant, the distance between employer, guest, and server disappeared completely. "Yesterday," Dominic said, "I looked at your uniform before I looked at your character. That was my mistake." Naomi stood quietly, uncertain where to rest her hands. She had never imagined hearing those words from someone whose reputation filled boardrooms and newspaper headlines alike. Dominic continued speaking without hesitation. "You protected my reputation, my partnership, and the integrity of everyone sitting here, even though nobody had ever asked you to carry that responsibility." Naomi answered softly, "Sir, I only believed everyone deserved to understand one another honestly." Dominic smiled faintly. "Exactly. That is why you did what professionals with impressive titles failed to do." Chairman Kong nodded in agreement before adding another sentence in Korean. Naomi translated with the same steady voice she had used since the beginning of the meeting. "He says that true education is revealed when knowledge serves other people instead of serving pride." Several members of the Korean delegation quietly applauded, not loudly or dramatically, but with sincere respect. To Naomi, the sound felt unfamiliar because it was never meant for someone carrying a serving tray. The restaurant manager watched from the doorway, visibly surprised that one of his newest employees had become the center of an international partnership. Dominic then reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a simple cream-colored business card. He placed it gently on the polished table instead of handing it to Naomi directly. "This is not a reward," he said. "It is an invitation. If you ever decide that your future belongs somewhere beyond this dining room, call me. I would rather work beside someone I can trust than someone who merely impresses me." Naomi looked at the card but did not reach for it immediately. She first looked toward Chairman Kong, then toward the attorneys, and finally around the room where every face that had once overlooked her now carried genuine respect. Only then did she pick up the card with both hands, grateful not because it promised opportunity, but because it represented something she had valued far longer than success. It represented being seen for who she truly was. 3 months passed, and the restaurant settled back into its familiar rhythm. Morning sunlight still spilled across the marble floors, crystal glasses still caught the golden light, and Naomi Carter still arrived before most of the staff, tying on the same black apron with the same quiet professionalism she had shown from her very first shift. Many things around her had changed, yet she refused to let recognition replace humility. She greeted every guest with the same warm smile, carried every tray with the same careful hands, and treated every customer with equal respect whether they ordered a cup of coffee or reserved the most expensive private dining room. The cream-colored business card Dominic Castellano had given her remained tucked safely inside the pages of an old notebook at home. She had never called. One crisp autumn afternoon, the restaurant manager hurried across the dining room looking unusually nervous. "Naomi," he said, "the private room has been reserved again." She nodded politely and prepared another tray, expecting another ordinary business lunch. When the doors opened, Dominic entered beside Chairman Kong and several familiar attorneys. This time, however, there were no stacks of contracts and no tense expressions waiting around the polished walnut table. Dominic smiled as soon as he saw her. "Would you join us for a few minutes?" Naomi hesitated. "Sir, I am on duty." The restaurant manager answered before Dominic could speak. "You are exactly where you need to be." Naomi quietly approached the table. Chairman Kong stood first and greeted her warmly in Korean, asking about her mother, her health, and whether she was still practicing the language every day. Naomi answered with an easy smile that reflected genuine affection rather than formal politeness. Dominic listened for a moment before speaking. 3 months ago, you reminded me that leadership begins with listening. Since then, every international meeting in my company has included 2 independent translators and complete bilingual document reviews. Nobody questions that policy anymore. Naomi looked genuinely surprised. Chairman Kong added another sentence in Korean. She translated with quiet humility. He says that several companies in Seoul have adopted the same practice after hearing what happened here. Dominic placed a small envelope on the table. Before you decide anything, I want you to know there is no expectation attached to this. Naomi opened it carefully. Inside was not an employment contract, but a scholarship letter covering a graduate program in international communication and cross-cultural negotiation at a respected university in New York, along with a note explaining that the education had been funded jointly by Dominic's organization and Chairman Kang's company. Naomi's eyes filled with grateful emotion. Why would you do this for me? Dominic answered without hesitation. Because talent should never remain hidden simply because opportunity arrived late. Chairman Kong smiled and spoke one final sentence in Korean. Naomi paused before translating because the words reminded her so much of Mrs. Han. He says that a person's greatest title is not waiter, executive, lawyer, or chairman. It is trustworthy. Naomi carefully folded the scholarship letter and held it close, not because it promised a different future, but because it confirmed something she had quietly believed all along. People may first notice a uniform, a job title, or the color of someone's skin, but character always speaks longer than appearances. As sunlight reflected across the windows overlooking Manhattan, the room settled into a peaceful silence, and on that ordinary afternoon, everyone present remembered what true dignity looks like.